The year was 1887, and grief was a physical thing in Clara Hale's house. It had weight, and it had a scent, like dust and dried roses. It lived in the stillness of her late husband's armchair, and in the suffocating silence that had replaced the sound of his steady breathing beside her in the night. For 6 months since Walter's passing, Clara had moved through her small, tidy home like a ghost, her world winnowed down to the 4 walls that held every memory she cherished and every sorrow that now defined her. Her life had become a litany of quiet, necessary routines. She woke with the pale dawn, her body aching with a loneliness that felt older than the mountains rimming the valley. She tended the small garden Walter had planted, her hands moving with a mechanical precision that required no thought, her mind a placid, grey sea of loss. Trips into the small town of Redemption were brief and purposeful, her face a stoic mask that deflected the pitying glances of the townsfolk. They knew her story. They knew of the fever that had swept through and taken Walter so swiftly, leaving Clara a widow at 32, stranded in a life she no longer recognized. They offered condolences that felt like stones in her pocket, heavy and useless. She was a woman encased in ice, frozen in the moment her world had ended. The townsfolk saw a resilient, if cold, woman bearing her burden with a respectable dignity. They did not see the nights she spent clutching Walter's worn shirt, the fabric a poor substitute for the man it once held. They did not feel the hollowness in her chest, an abyss so vast she feared she would one day simply collapse into it and disappear entirely. Her grief was a private, sacred thing, a fortress she had built around her heart to protect what little of it remained. One afternoon, when the sun beat down with a high plains fierceness and the air was thick with the scent of sagebrush, Clara walked. She often walked, pushing herself out of the house when the silence became too loud, seeking a different kind of emptiness in the sprawling, indifferent landscape. She followed no particular path, her boots scuffing dust from the dry earth as she moved toward the rocky outcrops that broke the monotony of the prairie, her gaze fixed on the distant, hazy line where the sky met the land. It was out there in the vast, quiet expanse that she felt her own smallness, and for a moment the crushing weight of her sorrow felt a little less absolute. It was in this state of detached wandering that she saw the child. At first, the figure was just a small disruption in the scenery, a speck of color against the browns and greens of the scrubland. As Clara drew nearer, the speck resolved into a little girl standing perfectly still beside a juniper bush. She could not have been more than 5 or 6 years old, with straight black hair that fell to her shoulders and eyes so dark they seemed to hold the shadow of the earth itself. She was Navajo, that much was clear from her features and the simple beaded tunic she wore. But she was alone, utterly and unnervingly alone. Clara's first instinct was one of cautious annoyance. A lost child was a problem, a complication she had no energy for. Her life was a carefully balanced structure of solitude, and this small person threatened to knock it over. She would take the girl to Sheriff Donovan and be done with it. That was the sensible, responsible thing to do. She stopped a few feet from the child, her shadow falling over her. "Are you lost?" Clara asked. Her voice was rusty from disuse, harsher than she intended. The little girl looked up, her expression not one of fear or distress, but of a strange and solemn purpose. She did not answer the question. Instead, she pointed a small, steady finger past Clara, further into the broken land. "My mother," she said, her voice soft and clear. "She is sleeping. She won't wake up." Clara's brows furrowed. She scanned the horizon, seeing nothing. No camp, no horses, no sign of a tribe or family. "Sleeping? Where are your people? Where is your father?" The child's dark eyes remained fixed on her, unwavering. A flicker of something that looked like hope, or perhaps just relief, passed through them. "She needs help waking up," the girl repeated, her focus absolute. She took a small step towards Clara, then turned and began to walk in the direction she had pointed, glancing back as if to ensure Clara was following. A knot of unease tightened in Clara's stomach. Every instinct told her to turn back, to march straight to the sheriff's office and report what she had found. This was not her concern. But the girl's calm insistence was disarming. There was no panic in her, only a child's simple, unshakable faith. It was a faith that grated against the hard shell of Clara's own shattered world, and yet it pulled at something deep inside her. A long-dormant filament of responsibility, of something other than the all-consuming duty to her own grief, began to glow with a faint and unwelcome warmth. With a sigh that felt like it was dredged from the very bottom of her soul, Clara Hale followed the child. The journey was not long, perhaps a quarter of a mile, but every step was fraught with a rising tension that thickened the air between them. Clara walked a few paces behind the girl, a silent, unwilling guardian. The child, whose name she still did not know, moved with a sureness that belied her age, her small feet navigating the rocks and thorny bushes as if she had walked this path 100 times. "What is your name?" Clara asked, the question an attempt to puncture the strange, heavy silence. The girl glanced back, her expression unreadable. "Yazhi," she said simply, and then turned her attention forward again, her mission clearly more important than pleasantries. Yazhi, little one. The name settled into the air, poignant and small against the vastness of the landscape. Clara's mind raced with grim possibilities. Had the girl's family been attacked? Were they hiding, or had they simply abandoned her? The last thought soured in her mouth. She had seen the hard side of life on the frontier, the desperation that could make people do terrible things. But the child's tunic was clean, her hair neatly combed. She had not been abandoned, she had been cared for, and recently. As they walked, Clara's initial irritation began to curdle into a slow, creeping dread. The child's refrain, "She's sleeping," played over and over in her head. A mother sleeping so deeply in the open wilderness that her own child could not wake her. It did not feel right. The conviction grew in Clara's gut, cold and certain, that they were not walking toward a slumbering woman. They were walking toward something else entirely. Her gaze softened as she watched the small figure ahead of her. She saw not just a nuisance now, but a child clinging to a fragile hope, a hope Clara knew was about to be shattered. The ice around her own heart seemed to thin, a painful cracking sensation that was almost forgotten. A protective instinct, an emotion she thought had been buried with Walter, stirred within her. She was no longer just following. She was accompanying Yazhi to the precipice of a terrible truth. They came to a small, secluded hollow, sheltered by a granite overhang that offered some protection from the elements. It was a hidden place, chosen with care. A small, smokeless fire pit held cold ashes. A water skin lay nearby, along with a woven basket containing a few dried berries. And there, on a bed of carefully arranged pine boughs and a worn blanket, lay a woman. Clara stopped dead, her breath catching in her throat. Yazhi ran forward the last few feet. "Mama," the little girl whispered, kneeling beside the still form. "I brought help. A woman. She will help you wake up." Clara's heart seized. From the entrance of the hollow, even in the dappled shade, she could see the truth with stark and brutal clarity. The woman's skin had a waxy, greyish pallor. A profound and unnatural stillness had settled over her, a stillness that went far beyond sleep. There was a faint, sweet, cloying odor on the air, a scent that Clara recognized with a sickening lurch from the room where Walter had drawn his last breath. It was the smell of death that had lingered for too long. This woman had not passed in the last few hours. She had been gone for days. A wave of dizziness washed over Clara. She leaned against the rock face for support, her mind struggling to comprehend the scene. This small child, Yazhi, had been keeping vigil. She had been staying here, alone, with her dead mother, talking to her, trying to wake her, surviving on a handful of berries and a little water. The sheer, heartbreaking innocence of it was a blow more powerful than any physical assault. It knocked the air from her lungs and left her hollow. In that moment, her own grief, the monolithic sorrow that had governed her every waking thought, seemed to shrink. It was still there, a constant, aching presence, but it was suddenly crowded by a new, urgent, and overwhelming wave of compassion and horror for the little girl kneeling in the dust. Yazhi gently shook her mother's shoulder. "Mama, please," she pleaded, her voice starting to tremble with the first hints of true fear. "Wake up now." Clara knew she had to act. She could not let this go on a moment longer. The truth was a terrible burden, but it was one she now had to help this child carry. Pushing herself off the rock, she took slow, deliberate steps into the hollow, her shadow falling over the tragic tableau. The moment hung suspended in time, thick with unspoken finality. Yazhi looked up at Clara, her dark eyes wide and pleading, searching for the miracle she had been promised by her own innocent heart. "She is very tired," Yazhi said, her voice small, a fragile defense against the encroaching truth. "She walked a long, long way." Clara's gaze fell from the child to the mother. She saw the peaceful, almost serene expression on the woman's face, a stark contrast to the grim reality of her condition. She saw the care with which Yazhi had evidently tended to her, brushing a stray leaf from her blanket, keeping the space around her tidy, as if orderliness itself could somehow reverse the irreversible. The love in those small, futile actions was a palpable force in the small hollow. Clara's own carefully constructed walls of grief crumbled to dust. The raw, immediate tragedy before her demanded more than stoic observation. It demanded a gentleness she thought she had lost, a strength she did not know she possessed. Her own pain was an old, familiar ache. This was a fresh, gaping wound, and she was the only one there to tend it. She knelt in the dirt beside Yazhi, the rough ground pressing into her knees. She did not look at the deceased woman again. Her focus was entirely on the living, breathing, heartbroken child beside her. "Yazhi," she began, her voice softer than it had been in months, cleared of the rasp of sorrow. She reached out, not to touch the child yet, but simply to close the distance between them. "Your mother loves you very, very much." Yazhi nodded, her lower lip trembling. "I love her too. That's why she needs to wake up, so I can tell her." A sharp pain lanced through Clara's chest. "She knows, little one," she said, her voice thick with emotion. She always knew. She took a slow, deep breath, choosing her next words with the care of someone disarming a bomb. Sometimes people get so tired that their bodies need to go into a long, long rest, a rest they don't wake up from. Yazhi's face clouded with confusion. "Like winter sleep?" she asked, a flicker of understanding dawning in her eyes. "But the sun is warm. It is not time for winter sleep." "It's a different kind of sleep," Clara explained, her heart breaking with every word. She finally placed a gentle hand on the child's small shoulder. Her spirit, it was time for her spirit to go on a journey, to the place where the ancestors wait. It's a peaceful place, but her body had to stay here to rest forever. The words hung in the still air. Forever. The concept was too large, too absolute for the small child to grasp, yet the finality in Clara's tone began to penetrate Yazhi's hopeful denial. She looked from Clara's earnest, pained face to her mother's still form. She reached out a hesitant hand and touched her mother's cheek. The skin was cool, unyielding. It was not the warmth of sleep. That single cold touch was the catalyst. The fragile dam of Yazhi's innocence broke. A guttural sob tore from her throat, a sound of such profound and primal grief that it seemed to shake the very rocks around them. The calm, purposeful child vanished, replaced by a tiny being consumed by a sorrow too vast for her frame. "No," she wailed, scrambling closer to her mother. "No, Mama. Wake up. Don't leave me." This was the moment. Clara acted without thinking, driven by an instinct more powerful than reason. She moved swiftly, gathering the small, convulsing child into her arms, pulling her away from the body and holding her tight against her chest. Yazhi fought against the embrace for a moment, her small fists beating weakly against Clara's shoulder, her cries raw and desperate. Clara did not flinch. She held on, absorbing the child's grief, her own body becoming a shield against the terrible sight of the still mother. "I know," she whispered into Yazhi's hair, her own tears now falling freely, mingling with the child's. "I know it hurts. It's all right to cry. I'm here. I'm right here." She had not offered such comfort, nor sought it, since Walter had died. She had believed herself empty of it, yet here it was, pouring from her, a wellspring she had not known existed. As she held the sobbing child, something shifted deep within her. The ice did not just crack, it melted, flooding her with a torrent of shared sorrow. She was not just comforting Yazhi, she was mourning with her, for the mother lost, for the husband gone, for the crushing loneliness that had defined them both. Yazhi's struggles subsided, her body going limp as her cries softened into shuddering, exhausted sobs. She clung to Clara, her small hands gripping the fabric of her dress as if it were a lifeline. In the quiet shelter of the rocks, surrounded by the evidence of a profound tragedy, a grieving widow and a newly orphaned child held each other, two solitary souls finding a strange and desperate anchor in their shared storm of loss. Clara knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The fortress of her grief had been breached, not by an enemy, but by a 5-year-old girl who needed her. Clara remained kneeling in the dust for a long time, holding Yazhi until the child's sobs quieted into the exhausted, hiccuping breaths of deep sleep. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and bruised purple, and the air grew cool. The task ahead was daunting. She had to get Yazhi back to town, report this to the sheriff, and arrange for the proper care of the deceased woman. But her first priority was the warm, sleeping weight in her arms. With an effort that was both physical and emotional, Clara rose to her feet, lifting Yazhi carefully. The child murmured in her sleep, her small face burrowed into Clara's shoulder. Looking one last time at the woman on the bed of boughs, Clara offered a silent prayer for her peace, for her journey, for the daughter she had so clearly loved. Then, turning her back on the hollow of sorrow, she began the slow walk back toward the distant lights of redemption. The walk back felt entirely different. The landscape was no longer just an empty expanse mirroring her own inner state, it was a space she had to traverse for a purpose. Yazhi's weight in her arms was a tangible responsibility, a grounding force against the disorienting swirl of her emotions. When she finally reached the edge of town, the familiar sight of the clapboard houses and the single dusty street seemed foreign, as if she was seeing them after an absence of years, not hours. Her first stop was not her own home, but the sheriff's office. Sheriff Donovan was a weary man with kind eyes who had known both Clara and Walter for years. He was locking up for the night when he saw her approaching, the sleeping child in her arms. His expression shifted from surprise to immediate concern. "Clara, what in God's name?" he began, stepping forward. "I need your help, Arthur," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. She didn't wait for him to invite her in, but pushed past him into the small, lamplit office and gently laid the sleeping Yazhi on a long wooden bench. In low, concise tones, she recounted the afternoon's events, from finding the child to the grim discovery in the rock hollow. She left out none of the heartbreaking details, her voice cracking only once when she described Yazhi trying to wake her mother. Sheriff Donovan listened without interruption, his face growing grimmer with each word. When she finished, he let out a long, heavy sigh and ran a hand over his face. "Sweet Lord," he murmured. "Poor child, poor woman." He looked at Yazhi, then back at Clara. "I'll get a couple of men and a wagon. We'll ride out there first thing at sunrise. We'll bring her back, give her a proper burial in the churchyard." She was Navajo, Clara stated quietly, but with emphasis. "She should have her own rights." The sheriff nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right. There's a small encampment a day's ride south of here. I'll send a rider. Maybe they knew her. They should be the ones to see to her." He paused, his gaze full of a new respect. "What about the girl, Clara? I can take her to the pastor's wife, or—" "No," Clara said, the word leaving her lips before she had even consciously formed the thought. She'll stay with me, for now." Sheriff Donovan studied her for a long moment. He saw the change in her. The hard, icy shell was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective resolve. The deep sadness was still in her eyes, but it was no longer the only thing there. "All right, Clara," he said softly, "if you're sure." She was sure. Carrying the still sleeping Yazhi, Clara walked the final block to her own home. The house was dark and silent, but as she stepped across the threshold, it felt different. For the first time in 6 months, she was not returning to an empty house. She carried the child into her own bedroom, the room she had once shared with Walter, and laid her gently on the bed. She covered her with a quilt, tucking it around her small frame. For a moment, she stood watching the rhythmic rise and fall of Yazhi's chest, a small, resilient life breathing in the heart of her stagnant grief. The following days were a whirlwind of quiet activity that reshaped Clara's existence. The sheriff and his men brought the mother's body back from the hills. As promised, a rider was sent south, and 2 days later, a small party of Navajo arrived. They were solemn and dignified, and they confirmed the woman's name was Desba, and that she and her daughter had been separated from their group during a flash flood weeks ago. They took their kinswoman to be buried according to their own traditions, their gratitude to Clara expressed not in effusive words, but in a single, respectful nod from their elder. The question of Yazhi remained. The elder offered to take her, to raise her among her own people. It was the logical, expected solution. But when Clara knelt and explained this to Yazhi, the little girl's dark eyes filled with a fresh terror. She said nothing, but her small hands clutched at Clara's dress, a silent, desperate plea. And in that moment, Clara Hale made a choice. She looked at the child who had, in a single afternoon, pulled her back into the world of the living. She thought of her silent house, of the long, empty years stretching before her, and she thought of the promise she had made in that hollow. "I'm here. I'm right here." "She will stay with me," Clara told the elder, her voice unwavering. "I will care for her." The decision sent ripples through the small community of redemption. Tongues wagged at the general store. Martha Blackwood, the pastor's wife, made a special visit, her face a mask of sanctimonious concern. "A widow, all alone," she clucked, taking in a savage child. "It isn't proper, Clara. People will talk. What life can you offer her?" Clara looked at Martha, her gaze cool and steady. "I can offer her a home," she said simply. "And I can offer her my love. I find that is more than enough." The dismissal was quiet, but absolute, and Martha left in a huff, leaving the scent of disapproval in her wake. There were whispers and sideways glances for weeks, but there was also unexpected kindness. The blacksmith, Mr. Callahan, left a small, carved wooden horse on her porch. Eleanor Vance, who ran the dry goods store, slipped an extra bag of candy into Clara's order, winking and saying, "For the little one." They saw a change in the widow Hale. They saw a woman with a purpose, a light rekindled in her eyes. Life in the small house on the edge of town found a new rhythm. It was a rhythm of two. The silence was replaced by Yazhi's soft questions, by the sound of her bare feet padding on the wooden floors, by the stories Clara read to her at night from Walter's books. Clara taught her English words, and Yazhi, in turn, taught Clara the Navajo names for the sun, the moon, and the wind that whispered through the pines. Grief did not vanish. It remained a part of Clara, a quiet undercurrent to her days. There were still moments when the sight of Walter's hat on its peg, or the scent of his pipe tobacco lingering in a drawer, would bring a fresh pang of loss. But the grief no longer owned her. It had made room for something new. The house that had been a shrine to a painful past was slowly becoming a home for a hopeful future. One evening, months later, Clara was sitting on the porch steps, watching the sky bruise into nightfall. Yazhi sat beside her, leaning her head against Clara's arm, her small hand resting trustingly in Clara's. They were quiet, but it was a comfortable silence, born of companionship, not loneliness. "The stars are coming out," Yazhi whispered, pointing a small finger at the first pinprick of light in the darkening sky. In Navajo, she called it Sotso, the big star. Clara squeezed her hand gently. "Yes, they are," she said. "They're beautiful." In the heart of her deepest sorrow, a lost child had led her to a grave and, in doing so, had guided her back to life. She had thought her heart was buried with Walter, but she had been wrong. It had only been sleeping, waiting for a small, persistent hand to take hold of it and gently, insistently wake it up. Looking at the vast, star-dusted sky and feeling the warm, living presence beside her, Clara Hale finally felt at peace. She was home.